Hi, my name is Tony Dong. Trumplomacy Four takeaways from Trump's Cuba policy. This is a rollback, not a reversal, of Obama's Cuba policy. In the main, it is a gift to the old guard Cuban Americans in Miami who opposed the detente and voted for Trump. So it bans financial transactions with the commercial arm of Cuba's military. But it also takes into account objections from US businesses that don't want to turn the clock back. Thus, it does not disrupt existing joint ventures and carves out other exceptions. Probably the most visible effect will be a slowdown of American visitors, who took advantage of looser travel rules that Trump says he'll now strictly enforce. Here are some takeaways. 1. Human rights really? President Trump framed his policy in the human rights concerns of his Miami constituency, which passionately opposes the Cuban government's ongoing repression of political freedoms. And it bears the stamp of hawkish Cuban American lawmakers such as Senator Marco Rubio, who see Obama's historic opening as an appeasement of the Castro regime. But Trump's critics question why he singled out Cuba for such treatment when he has made a point of not lecturing other nations such as Saudi Arabia and the Philippines for bad behavior. I welcome the administration bringing up human rights globally, but Trump shouldn't use it as an excuse to carry out a more extreme political agenda, Democratic Senator Ben Cardin told me. Aside from the president's determination to fulfill a campaign promise to Miami, many Democrats believe has simply bent on reversing Obama's signature policies. 2. Same solution, different strategies. Everyone agrees that a flourishing Cuban private sector is the key to political change. The disagreement is how to encourage it. Trump's policy promises to channel funds away from the communist state and to the people who, says Mr. Rubio, will in the long term create a Cuban business class independent of the government. U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson says it's a matter of law. He told a recent Senate hearing that the administration believes it's illegal for the U.S. to provide financial support to the Cuban regime. Pro-engagement advocates think that doesn't make any sense in a country where the authorities control so much of the economy. They fear this approach will ultimately stifle what private enterprise has managed to benefit from rapprochement. 3. Same frustration, different responses. However, there is frustration across the political spectrum that detente has done little to trigger political and economic reform in Cuba. When he was Secretary of State, John Kerry's people used to give us charts outlining what they called the internal embargo ways the Cuban government could but didn't make the most of America's economic opening. According to Republican Senator Bob Corker, it's almost like it's ingrained in them that whatever it is the US wishes for them to do, they are not going to do, just to demonstrate that the revolution is still alive. It's probably true that these aging communist rebels have resistance hardwired in their DNA, after decades of defining their nationalism in opposition to American overt and covert intervention. Obama decided to take the American bad guy out of the equation. Trump's moves may put it back in, and return Cuban hardliners to their comfort zone. 4. New old adversaries. Trump's team certainly wants to put pressure back into the equation. Mr. Tillerson said the opening to Cuba had removed Havana's incentive to change and Washington's ability to force the issue. But Cuba's leaders don't respond well to such treatment. They've made very clear they will not let outsiders push them into making political reforms. As expected, they didn't take kindly to Trump's blistering takedown of a cruel and brutal communist regime that's committed terrible crimes in service of a depraved ideology. Whatever the practical economic consequences of this new old policy, it could well reinstate the adversarial relationship Obama sought to
Thank you for watching. For the follow-up, subscribe to the channel yourself here. Increasingly difficult. For Cecilia Munoz, who spent 2 decades as a leading immigrant rights advocate before serving as Obama's White House domestic policy advisor. The Trump wrecking ball followed her to the end of the earth. After serving 8 years in the Obama White House, Moniz had booked a hiking vacation in New Zealand to begin the day after Obama left office January the 20th, traveling as far from the United States as she could get. 6 days after she arrived in New Zealand, however, Trump announced a sweeping travel ban on citizens of 7 majority Muslim countries, sowing chaos at several airports as federal authorities detained dozens of travelers. I checked in on the news a couple times a day to be aware of what was happening, much to my husband's dismay, said Moniz, now a vice president at the New America think tank. Then I worked off my feelings on the hypes. The good news for the Obama world is that Trump, at least so far, has not brought quite as much radical change as he promised on the campaign trail. He backed off suggestions that his administration would seek to end the U.S. involvement in the NATO alliance. He has not ended a deferred action program for some undocumented immigrants. The travel ban was halted by the courts. And Congress has balked at Trump's proposal to spend billions for a war on the Mexican. On the flip side, Trump has installed a conservative Supreme Court justice, withdrawn the United States from the Paris Climate Accord, moved to relax broad swaths of Obama's regulatory agenda, and drastically reduced the acreage of national lands the former president had sought to preserve as federal monuments. The Republican-led Senate is nearing a vote on legislation to repeal Obama's signature health care law. If you live in NV, ACME, OWV, as Orco, please call your senators and tell them not to pass Trumpcare. We need to pressure them now, Tommy Vietor, a former Obama foreign policy spokesman, wrote on Twitter this week. Vietor and several other former Obama aides, including Favreau and fellow speechwriter John Lovett, as well as political advisor Dan Pfeiffer, had been among the most outspoken Obama alums through Pod Save America, a twice-weekly podcast aimed at fomenting opposition to the Trump presidency. Their guest on June the 1st was Brian Dees, a former Obama senior advisor who had worked closely on the Paris Climate Accord. Dees called into the show from his home in Portland, Maine, just hours before Trump was scheduled to appear in the White House Rose Garden to announce his decision on whether to withdraw from the Paris deal. In an interview Friday, Dees said he later felt compelled to watch Trump's announcement and found it incredibly frustrating because it was all predicated on a totally false premise. Dees remains buoyed by the possibility that the Obama administration's efforts to get countries such as China and India to sign on to reducing carbon emissions will pay long-term dividends despite Trump's actions. On a personal level, however, he found the president's rationale embarrassing. I have trouble explaining the logic to my 4-year-old daughter, he said. Asked if she understands how hard he worked on the global accord, Dees was hopeful. I think she has a sense of what her dad was fighting for, he said. Thank you for watching. For the follow-up, subscribe to the channel yourself here.
To go down in history as a guy who tried and failed, said the advisor. He doesn't want to be the second president in history to resign. Thank you for watching. For the follow-up, subscribe to the channel yourself here.
Thank you for watching. For the follow-up, subscribe to the channel yourself here.